Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are in a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Grillin' JR with the voice of wrestling, Mr. Jim Ross. Jim, how are you, man?
I'm fine, Conrad. Thanks for asking. Hope you're well as too. And we're here in the hot of summer here in America. It's hot in Oklahoma. It's hot in Jacksonville. It's hot everywhere. But we want to wish everybody a early, happy 4th of July. Be careful. Have fun. Watch your social gathering. Wear your mask. Be smart, don't be defiant, and enjoy the holiday. And whatever the hell you do some grilling, man. It's Conrad, there's no better holiday to grill, for me anyway, than the 4th of July.
It is a top 5 grilling holiday, and we hope you guys are stocking up over at jrsbbq.com. We hope you enjoyed Fighter Fest Part 1 last night. Of course, Part 2 coming up next Wednesday. But today it's all about Bret Hart. Believe it or not, today, July 2nd, is Bret Hart's birthday. So we wanted to do a bit of a Bret Hart show. And the original idea was, let's cover Bret's 96 and 97. And then I sent you all of my notes, Jim. It's over 100 pages. I don't think there's any way we get through both years today.
No, probably not. That just says how auspicious Bret's career has been. And was in the ring. One of my favorite talents I ever worked with, one of the favorite men I've ever known. Through Bret, got introduced to his massive family, spent time actually in the dungeon with Bret and Stu. So it's nothing but great memories by and large, for thinking about Bret. So this should be a fun show. One of the most respected guys in all of pro wrestling, who always stood on his principles and always had great character, and he let his work speak for itself. So I'm going to really look forward to this one, Conrad.
It's some of our most comprehensive work, and we've posted our show format like always over at adfreeshows.com. There's no way we'll get to all of 97. I think we'll probably just cut it off after 96 today, and we'll come back to 97 another time. But 96 was quite the interesting year in wrestling. Of course, Bret starts 96 as the world champ, having just won the title at Survivor Series against Diesel. And the match is probably most remembered for being one of the very first times someone went through an announcer's table. And I think it was one of Diesel's best matches in the WWF. I think Meltzer even dug it. He gave it 3.5 stars. I'm sure we'll talk about that in long form some other time. In December of 95, Bret found himself defending the title against the British Bulldog at In Your House, and it was a bloodbath that Meltzer gave 4.5 stars. And in spite of these great matches, Bret felt that no matter how hard he worked, all the attention was on Shawn during this time, even going so far as to say he felt this run was almost as a transitional champion for him. He wrote in his book, "I'd given Vince a 5-star match with Diesel, but it was so quickly passed over, it was soon forgotten. Even the buildup to my In Your House match against Davey was non-existent, with all that attention being lavished on the ex-champion and apparently seriously injured Shawn." Of course, the injury that Bret is referencing is the Marine incident, which we'll cover on an upcoming Shawn Michaels episode, I'm sure. But let's talk about this. When did Vince decide and let you know WrestleMania 12 is about making Shawn Michaels?
Early on, at that time, the plans for major events such as WrestleMania were made a little bit more farther out than I feel like they are nowadays. So, but Shawn was, he kept having great match after great match, and he had the one thing that Vince loved, Conrad, and that's sizzle, the charisma. Shawn had an abundance of that, and I think Vince has always been somewhat of a fan of sizzle at times more than steak. And certainly Bret always delivered steak. I thought he had plenty of sizzle, but Shawn was the flavor of the week. And that's not, I'm not knocking Shawn, because I've always said that Ric Flair and Shawn Michaels are the two best all-around in-ring performers that I can remember working for, or working matches for. So I think the sizzle is all about the sizzle, quite frankly. But it wasn't something that was just a spur of the moment decision. It was thought through, and that was what the direction he decided to go. So it was interesting. But you got two great workers. You can't lose either guy as your champion, quite frankly. So I think that's the story. Just sizzle was the name of the game.
Well, so if that's true, that we knew that, hey, that's the goal, then Bret's right? He really is a transitional champion, because we don't want Diesel and Shawn at WrestleMania. We want Bret and Shawn at WrestleMania, but no matter who's there with Shawn's going over. So in a sense, we're going to put the belt on Bret because we know he can give Shawn the type of WrestleMania match we need for Shawn, right?
Yeah. Bret had the great skill set to make anybody better than they actually were. And when you were as good as Shawn Michaels and you could work with an opponent on a level like WrestleMania, then it's even better. So if you really want to anoint somebody and quote unquote make them, then that great match with Bret is what you needed. And Bret was the perfect guy to do that. So in that context, Bret was somewhat of a transitional champion.
Let me ask, why not just go with Diesel? I know that sounds silly, but is it because you just done Shawn Diesel at 11? Because here at 12, it does feel like, well, Diesel's a heel and Shawn is a babyface and they're friends in real life, and maybe Diesel's on his way out anyway. Could that have made sense, or did it not make sense since maybe Diesel is leaving and we don't want to put shine a spotlight on him? Or is it more, we had just done it at WrestleMania 11?
I think we had just done it at WrestleMania 11. Vince is not, even when I'll give you an example. You could headline WrestleManias as long as they were both healthy and there with Rock and Austin forever.
Yeah.
And so that was an exception to the rule. But in regard to that statement, Austin and Rock wrestled at WrestleMania 15, 17, and 19.
Yeah.
Buffers. They didn't do back-to-backs.
Right.
So I think there's some thought in that regard. But by and large, I think what you're going to get is a better match. You're going to get a better match. And if you want Shawn to have that, obviously you would not do a Iron Man match with Diesel and Shawn. That would not have fit the skill sets of Diesel. It would have been very challenging for Shawn. You get a 7-foot super heavyweight type opponent in Kevin. He's not a 60-minute guy. Could he go 60? Of course he could, but that's not his forte. It would have not been good booking. So I think that's a situation there. Just didn't want to go back to back. And quite frankly, anybody that's paying attention would know that Bret and Shawn were going to give you a hell of a performance, one that people still talk about, such as we are here today.
Let's talk about the Royal Rumble. It goes down January 21st in Fresno. Bret's going to defend the world title against the Undertaker. This is at the time a very rare babyface versus babyface match with two of the top guys. And it sort of happens cold too. Why does this make sense for a Royal Rumble main event?
I don't know that it does make sense, quite frankly. But the babyface versus babyface situation doesn't concern me at all. I have no issues with babyface matches because the prize, the goal, the common denominator that links these two baby faces together is who leaves as a champion. So it's all about the championship. Hence why I believe that championships should go on last more often than not, with a few exceptions to that rule. So, I didn't have a problem with the babyface component whatsoever. But the match could have had a better build. But Undertaker was made. He's going to fight for the championship, all that good stuff, and I had no issues with it. But it was unique at that time to have a match that on that level between two baby faces. But I thought it worked out fine. I don't know. Meltzer gave it 2.25, 3/4 stars, or whatever the hell it was. I thought it was a good story. They went 28 minutes. It's fun to call. So I had no issues with that whatsoever, that booking.
Let's keep it moving and let's talk about the match itself. Undertaker hits the tombstone on Bret, and when the ref is counting, Diesel comes down, pulls the ref out. It causes the DQ at 28:31. Meltzer gave it 2 3/4 stars, and Bret was critical of the finish, saying it did little to build him for Mania. What do you remember about Bret's feelings at this time? It feels, when you go through his book here in this era, that he's really just sort of frustrated with the booking and maybe the fact that he doesn't feel like he's the long-term plan at this point. Do you remember Bret being particularly frustrated in the first quarter of 96?
Well, not specifically. 96 is a long time ago. But I know he was in general at times frustrated with creative. And I think that comes back to a lack of communication. I just think that Bret and Vince should have been speaking more often, more in depth. And Bret felt kind of like he was being passed over, futured, as they say sometimes. So yeah, he had some frustrations without a doubt, but I still say it all comes back to communication. There's not great communication there at that point in time.
The next night on Raw, Bret would wrestle the new Intercontinental Champion Goldust, who had just won the title the night before from Razor Ramon. Bret wins the match by submission, and he said he worked the match with a sprained knee, and Dustin really looked after him in the match. And then later that night, he would wrestle The Undertaker to a no contest after Raw. I mentioned this because Razor has been on record as saying he had a problem working with Goldust. How did Bret receive the character?
Professionally, objectively, it was a gimmick. That's all. It's a TV persona, for God's sakes. And I don't know if Razor had a problem working with Goldust because of the character, the Goldust character, the androgynous, mysterious, kind of darkly sexual type persona, or because it could not have been Goldust work. There's no way that you can say that Dustin was not a great worker and could have a good match with anybody. So I think maybe it was more that he didn't want to sell for a guy that he perceived. It's that old homophobic thing, man. It's just, I even hate to mention that, but I think maybe, and even Goldust's character wasn't projected as gay, at least in my opinion, but nonetheless, I think it had to be the character and not the actual application of the match.
January 23rd in San Jose, Bret would beat Diesel in a cage to retain. The next day they're in White Plains. So process what we're talking about. On the 23rd, we're in San Jose. On the 21st or 24th rather, we're in White Plains, New York, and he's winning over Goldust here. And 2 days later, Bret would beat Diesel in a cage at Madison Square Garden. And he says on the 27th, he has a conversation with Shawn. Rumors earlier that day were that Diesel and Razor might jump to WCW, and Shawn tells Bret that he hopes they could still work together after he wins the title at WrestleMania. And Bret suggested to Shawn that he work with new guys like Steve Austin and Big Van Vader. Shawn then tells Bret, I'd rather work with Hunter and do a little program with the 1-2-3 Kid. And that conversation definitely rubbed Bret the wrong way. He talks about that story to this day. He even talked about it on that Bret versus Shawn Greatest Rivalries DVD. He said
I was a part of that, by the way.
Yes,
I did the interview with those guys.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
He said he felt like Shawn was just angling to work with his buddies. Do you remember hearing that? Did you take any great issue with Shawn really wanting to work with his friends? That doesn't seem like that's that uncommon.
Taking great issue was not how I would phrase that or bracket it for me. Not unusual, guys wanting to work with people that they liked, because a great wrestling match has to have a inordinate amount of cooperation and unselfishness. And so I think that was kind of where that was. I thought Bret gave Shawn great advice, but on the other hand, if Shawn was going to, as the champion, was going to work with Triple H, then that ain't going to be a bad match either. The 1, 2, 3 Kid was obviously to help Sean Waltman get a boost up, and I had no problem with that in theory. So both guys had good information, but that was the situation. And Sean finally got in that position where he's going to be the champ. The champ has a lot of a clout as to who they want to work with, because as a promoter, you want to put the best match that you can get in the ring. The constant was going to be Shawn. So now it is, who do we put Shawn with that he can have this great match that he perceives he'll have against a Triple H and or X-Pac, 1, 2, 3 Kid. So both guys had good points, but that's not unusual. Or that, Austin had the same Rock. All these guys, they had guys they liked to work with, and then Vince would understand who they liked to work with, who could produce a better match for the fans, and that's kind of generally the way that he went. So it was interesting time, and Shawn was feeling his oats, and Bret was feeling a little bit disrespected, and kind of like, well, I guess the best way is to say disrespected. I think Bret was feeling that he was being taken advantage of for all his years of service, his quality work, what he meant to the company. I think that was kind of the overriding feeling, I would think anyway, for Bret at that time.
Bret would write that without consulting him on the decision, Shawn and Pat Patterson had decided that at WrestleMania, Bret and Shawn were going to wrestle in a 1-hour Iron Man match, and Shawn was going to beat Bret with the super kick. And Bret said that he could tell Shawn was expecting him to balk at the thought of putting him over, but Bret told him he'd put him over clean in the middle, and Shawn thanked him profusely. It's been said over the years that Pat suggested they work in an Iron Man match at WrestleMania at Vince, and Vince at first wasn't interested in it, but Bret would say that Pat just kept on him about it, and eventually Vince gives in and agrees to let him have this style match. Do you remember Pat being the guy pushing for the Iron Man match, and how did you feel about it, and what do you think Vince's hesitation was?
Well, we said this before. Sometimes, I think Vince loves the business, but I think sometimes he doesn't love it enough to watch an hour match. And I think Vince is concerned that can these two great performers keep the attention of the audience at WrestleMania for a 1-hour time limit. Personally, I love those Iron Man matches. Some of my favorite matches I've ever called have been where you've had so many falls in a time limit. I remember, we've had matches, the Iron Man match with Cena was in one, I remember, maybe two, but other guys as well. It gives you it's a great story for the announcers to tell, because now the clock becomes a vital part of the process. And I like that aspect. People could understand that. They could follow the clock on the screen. So I like the idea. Patterson's idea, knowing that Vince wanted the title on Shawn, Vince is trying to set up a situation, quite frankly, that if executed correctly, was going to make Bret shine as well. Because in an hour, seeing an hour of Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, for a real wrestling fan, as Patterson was not a bad idea whatsoever. So the Iron Man match was, I thought, a good idea. It was different. It had never been done before at WrestleMania that I'm aware of. So I think that was a situation there that Vince was concerned. Will the audience accept a 60-minute time limit? Because it's not like they're going to have a 1-hour time limit, and whoever wins the first fall wins the match. It's 60 minutes without question, no matter what the score is. So I think that was kind of what that was to me, and I thought it was a good idea, quite frankly.
We should also mention that around this same time, Bret tells Vince that after WrestleMania, he's going to be taking 6 months off to do a full season of Lonesome Dove. And Vince tells Bret he really needs him to work the foreign tours, which Bret says no problem too. Do you remember Bret asking for time off? Were you concerned it might hurt the house shows, or were you guys okay with it, since you're really trying to establish Shawn as the top babyface after WrestleMania?
Well, you don't want to lose the talent at Bret's level. There were very few guys who were ever at Bret's level. So yeah, it's going to hurt the house shows if he's not on the cards. He sells tickets, does Bret. But Bret was ahead of the curve with a lot of our guys as far as getting a shot at doing things outside pro wrestling, i.e. this Lonesome Dove TV series. So to me, I thought that Bret being on the Lonesome Dove series for a season in a solid role, a very strong reoccurring role, was good for wrestling because it showed that one of our guys, our top guy, or one of our top guys for sure, was desired by others to perform in another arena, shall we say. So I thought at the end of the day, that was going to be a good thing.
Here's an interesting show. February 3rd in India, Bret would beat Tatanka. Show does over 30,000 fans on outdoor cricket pitches. And Bret said on the 6th day of this tour of India, Diesel tells him that him and Razor really are going to WCW for $750,000 a year. And Bret would write in his book that this was more than he was making. How did this news affect the locker room, and when did Vince and the office find out?
I think it alienated the locker room somewhat. Both Kevin and Scott are strong personalities, very outspoken. You never had to guess what was on their mind or their mood. They were very readily willing to experience that or to demonstrate that, better said. So, but Bret's ability to draw outside of the United States, the only person I could think that had any kind of impact like that to that point was Hogan.
Right.
But Bret, for whatever reason, and there's a lot of ways you could skin this cat, Bret was extremely over, not only he was over in North America, obviously, but the audiences abroad, UK, etc., India, whatever, understood, they respected Bret. They respected the art of wrestling, and Bret brought that every single time. So the tours were imperative, those big paid tours. We bring your A team. So I'm sure that a lot of the people in the locker room had two emotions. One is, some will say, the minority will say, well, I'm happy for those guys getting a big payday. And some other people were saying, good riddance, let them go, because it created openings. It created spots, and those spots then became up for grabs. So mixed emotions. But I don't know why talents tell each other talents how much they're earning. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but nonetheless, that number was bandied about, and I'm sure it was hard to swallow for some guys.
On Raw on February 5th, Bret would beat The Undertaker by DQ to retain. On the 17th of February, Bret would travel down to the USWA in Memphis and wrestle Jerry Lawler in a cage. Bret would retain here, of course, but the show draws an all-time gate record for the city, breaking any previous WWF, NWA, or even Jarrett marks. How did Bret like working in Memphis? That's a little old school for him.
Yeah, he loved it. I think he loved it because it was more traditional, a more traditional audience. He had fun being the visiting heel in Lawler's home territory. Lawler, an icon in Memphis for sure. Obviously, you don't work on top in a territory for multiple generations, not just multiple months or years, generations, decades. And Lawler was, people thought they wanted to see magic. They wanted to see, Lawler win, like he beat, I guess it was, who did he beat for the AWA title? Kurt, or was it Bockwinkel? Whatever. They wanted another magical night. So Bret had fun working as a heel, a wrestling heel. There's a difference in a wrestling heel and a meat chopping, kicking, stomping heel. So he always had fun down there, and he got paid well, and he got respected. And so all the variables of the boxes you want to check for a talent they were checked. So I've always thought that, to the best of my knowledge, Bret had fun. I remember talking to him. How was it in Memphis? Oh, it's a lot of fun. Well, that's good. That's all you need to hear. It was a lot of fun.
The next big show is In Your House 6, Rage in the Cage. It goes down on February 18th, 1996 from the Louisville Gardens. In the main event, Bret would defend the title against Diesel in a steel cage. This is the cage match where Diesel is about to go through the door, where the Undertaker pops up through the ring, and he's coming after Diesel, which allows Bret to escape over the top for the win. I think this is the first time something like this happens in the WWF. What'd you think of, that creative of having the Undertaker come through the ring canvas?
Unique, again, a different presentation, a novel way of getting another major star involved in the title picture. Was it everybody's flavor of ice cream? Probably not, but it was different, and it was unique and it was memorable. So no issues. I don't know whose idea it was. It was a good idea. Patterson, Bruce, Vince himself. Who the hell knows? But or it might have been the talent had an idea. That happens too occasionally. So no issues. Uniqueness. It was different. We kept trying to reinvent and do things better, but also do things with a more unique touch. And this certainly was a unique touch.
Yeah, very unique. And Nash tells the story that Bret didn't like the idea of taking a jackknife and Taker saving him as a finish because it made it look like he was about to get beat. And Undertaker supposedly said something like, "Motherfucker, everything isn't about you." Do you remember hearing this story that maybe Bret and Taker had words before the finish here?
I never did, but it wouldn't surprise me that they had a man-to-man discussion. Again, Bret was very defensive because of how he perceived he was being treated and communicated with by Vince and all the higher ups. Bret was not a glad hander. Bret was not a guy that would, when he got to TV, the first thing he'd do go to Vince's office, makeshift office in the arena. He always respected Vince. But he was not a guy that really tried to gravitate to him and the big hugs and the attaboys and the pats on the back and all that stuff. He was all business. And I think the general perception for him was that he didn't want to be perceived as weak. But I had no problem with that. The finish has been done like that forever, where if you know that he's getting ready to go do this Lonesome Dove thing, you've got to get other guys ready as well. And so I didn't think that finish was a bad thing. I didn't think it made Bret look weak at all. But nonetheless, Bret thought that. And that's all that really mattered.
Let's also mention that Bret would write in his book about this. Being saved by interference at 2 pay-per-views in a row did nothing to keep a babyface champion like me strong. And he would say later that day, he called the Lonesome Dove offices and the producer of the show, Steve North, informed him the series had been canceled. And Bret says this news, of course, broke his heart. It's apparent that Bret wanted and maybe thought the next step for him was acting, and maybe this is the big break, and now it's seemingly taken away. But even though the show was canceled, Bret decides to stick with his original plan and what he had told Vince: "I'm going to take 6 months off after WrestleMania." And the next night on Raw, Bret said that he was happily surprised to see Roddy Piper at the Cincinnati Gardens for Raw. Piper's been made the new president of the WWF, and Bret said that Vince got him, Roddy, and Shawn together and carefully rehearsed the live interview they were going to have to do that night to get us ready for WrestleMania. And Bret said when he went to the ring that night, Shawn and Vince were already in the ring, and Bret said every word out of Shawn's mouth had so much more impact than what he had been told to say. And Bret said Vince was right there to make sure Shawn was humble, lovable, and not too Shawnish, whatever that may mean. Go ahead.
Egocentric,
sure.
Strong personality. The same thing could be said that Undertaker allegedly had words with Bret that we just mentioned. The same thing, I'm sure Undertaker's had some conversations with Shawn too over the years. That was just Taker's way. He was a team guy, total team guy, as was Bret. But again, the outside pressures and seeing his relationship seemingly start to disintegrate with Vince was a major issue for Bret, which tells me that Bret had this great respect for Vince. Vince was his guy. He thought he was Vince's guy. And then there was a new kid on the block. There's a new kid in town, as the Eagles would say.
No doubt about it. And that's what they're trying to get over here is, hey, we've got a new sheriff in town for WrestleMania. And, during the interview, Shawn brags about how well conditioned he was, shows off his abs, and Bret then compares himself to the little pink bunny in the Energizer battery commercials, that he just keeps going and going. And that's when Roddy explained the rules of the Iron Man match. And Bret says that while he was over in India, sick with the shits, Shawn had been home training like a lunatic. And he would write in his book, damned if he wasn't in incredible shape. And then we're off to the races after that. We've got a couple of double shots on February 25th in Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Both times Bret wins over the Undertaker by count out. And then in February, the company sends, or late February, the company sends cameras to Calgary to film Bret training for the Iron Man match. And they had already filmed Shawn in San Antonio, running stadium steps, doing upside down sit-ups, pretending to spar with his mentor, Jose Lothario. And Bret said that Shawn was selling, or Vince was selling Shawn as a guy trying to realize the boyhood dream of winning the gold. Meanwhile, Bret is portrayed as the wily veteran from the dungeon who had every intention of being the champion for a long time. Of course, the trouble here in the shoot is it's the coldest time of the year in Calgary, and they've got him running and trying to get panoramic views of the city. He says, I don't think JR and the camera crew were trying to be funny, but I couldn't help but see the humor in the footage they shot. It was so icy that I had to run carefully. So it came across on film like I was running a mile an hour.
Yeah, it was colder than hell, I can tell you that. Yeah, I had nothing to do with the weather. I couldn't control that, but it was one of the fun trips I took, and did one of the fun assignments I took, should say. And we wanted to show all phases of an athlete training, and that would include some road work, but obviously those clips are short, but it did get him outside. It did show him running, and that's kind of all we wanted to do. We didn't need a lot of running, but we just needed to show a little running. The same thing, you will talk about I wanted him to swim in his indoor pit. Bret had an indoor pool at his home. And so we set all of it up. Then I come to find out, well, Bret can't swim. Uh-oh. So we did that in an abbreviated form. So we just showed some very short, succinct clips of Bret swimming. Again, all of us had done, Conrad, was to improve cardio.
Right.
You're going to go an hour. You got to work on your cardio. You're not worried about how much bigger your arms are going to be, how much more you can bench press, all these things. Cardio was the name of the game for a 60-minute Ironman match. And all we wanted to do was to illustrate the things Bret was doing to improve his cardio. And the swimming was one thing and the running was another. So, and then of course we ended up putting Bret in the dungeon with Stu.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because Bret would say the topper was when they filmed Stu stretching me in the dungeon and an 80-year-old man tying me up in knots with me eagerly tapping out. And it is kind of funny when you look back at this. I mean, the footage of Shawn training looks like it's out of a Rocky Balboa montage. And then, well, Bret's isn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, drinking my coffee here this morning. Yeah. Shawn Bret knew the finish. He knew what was going on.
Kind of is what it is.
What's that?
It kind of is what it is.
Yeah, it is what it is. And, but it wasn't the most advantageous time to go do outdoor things in Calgary. I get that too, but that wasn't my call. I just did what I did and went and did my job. And the thing about Stu, to be honest with you, at least in my recollection, Conrad, Stu kind of went into business for himself. He wasn't involved. He wasn't interested in the work aspect of pro wrestling. He was a shooter mentality, old school, hard ass, tough guy that would beat your ass wrestling and beat your ass with submissions. And I think that the idea was when we were doing this is that we wanted Stu to demonstrate some unique ways to earn a submission or to debilitate his opponent. Then Stu got a little carried away, and he took it a little over the edge. So it never was designed to make Bret look weak. It was designed to make Bret look like he was going to his father, the patriarch of the Hart family, to show him new submissions that he might be able to utilize in this matchup.
Let's give you a sort of a peek into the mind of Bret Hart. He writes of this match that he had been training as hard as he had for this as anything else. He said, quote, Shawn was 8 years younger than me, and I wasn't going to let him outshine me. Like me and Davey at Wembley, I wanted the fans to remember the loser. I saw a matchup ahead with me taking back the title, which would build up for yet one more match where I'd be more than happy to put Shawn over, to once and for all thrust the torch into his hand. Done right, Shawn and I could draw money for years with a big rivalry, taking turns putting each other over. Doesn't everyone sort of assume that that's the plan when you head into WrestleMania 12, that this is our new great rivalry? Maybe like Macho Man and Hulk Hogan before, or from your side of things, maybe it could be the new Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat.
Yeah. Or, the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier. There are a lot of illustrations there, that we could utilize, but yeah, that was the deal. Because you got two great stars that had really the contrary at that time, they didn't have great chemistry outside the ring, but I always thought that, Bret and Shawn complimented the hell out of each other. I enjoyed their matches. I enjoyed their interactions. So, but that was obviously the thought. This is not going to be a one-off. We're building this amazing rivalry that we can revisit, just about any time with the proper reintroduction.
Let's keep it moving and run you through what he's doing as we get into March. On March 3rd, he beats the Bulldog, in Springfield, Mass. Later in the show, Bret would beat Shawn in a lumberjack match. The next day in Providence, same thing. On March 5th, we would see, Bret beat Shawn in a lumberjack in Austin, Texas. On the 11th, they're in San Antonio for a television taping. Bret would beat Tatanka, and then later Bret would beat the Undertaker by countout. In Hartford, 4 days later, Undertaker would team with Bret to take on Shawn and Diesel, which is a little interesting. And then in Landover, this is of note, this is March 16th. And as far as I know, this is the first triple threat match in WWF history. And the first three opponents, Bret, Undertaker, and Diesel. Do you remember this when they started doing triple threat matches? I mean, this is, as far as I know, a bit of an innovation for the company. I mean, not to say it hadn't happened before. Certainly ECW had been doing them, but I think this is the first triple threat in WWF history. What'd you think of the concept?
I loved it, and I booked it a lot when I was booking house shows, because we had, several talents that, you could, feasibly see in a title situation. You could feasibly see in a three-way match. That was a nice problem to have, to be able to add another star to that already, combustible, feuds and rivalries that we had. But I liked it. And like I said, if you go back and look at some of my booking, over the years, I did that in a lot of house shows, three ways. I liked the three-way where it was an elimination three-way better than the first guy to get a fall, because the only negative about a three-way, when you say, well, the first guy to score pin or submission wins, that means that the reigning champion, the guy that's a champion entering the match, has no championship advantage. That person, the champion, doesn't even have to be involved in the decision to lose the title. And that was one thing about the triple threat matches structured in the sudden death, first guy to get a fall or submission wins it, that I didn't really embrace. But it was what it was in that respect. But I liked the three ways. It was for a house show, Conrad, it's a lot of star power in your main event.
Yeah, it is.
So I think that was the deal. It checked more boxes than it didn't. But the negative of it for me was that the champion did not have to be involved. And you can say, well, it put the champion in jeopardy. I get all those things. I call those matches. I understand that. But still, it didn't make a lot of common sense. But it is pro wrestling, and sometimes pro wrestling has been known to do things that just didn't make a lot of common sense.
Well, I'll tell you what does make a lot of sense. March 17th, Madison Square Garden, Bret and Undertaker on one side, Shawn and Diesel on the other. Diesel would hit Shawn with a chair after the match, which explains how, they're teaming up a good guy with a bad guy. But Meltzer would write of this March 17th show, the Bret Hart, Undertaker, Shawn, and Diesel match on March 17th drew the first sellout at Madison Square Garden for a non-pay-per-view event in so many years. Nobody can remember the last one. It also set an all-time record house show gate. How big of a deal is this to Vince to finally sell out MSG again after all those years in the muck of 93 and 94 and 95? And it happens right before WrestleMania 12. This has to give a lot of excitement heading into the biggest show of the year, does it not?
Yeah, because we saw an interest to sell out the Garden, which is not automatic, especially for a house show without TV cameras there and a pay-per-view or a Raw or whatever it was very encouraging. There was great interest in these individuals and their quest for one. All of them had one goal, to be the champion, and I like that aspect of it. So I remember it very well. Vince always stood behind the curtain during that short entrance, watching the matches, and his dad stood in the same place. I'm told. Arnie Skolin used to tell me those stories that Vince's dad would sit there, and he had this hobby, or not hobby, a habit, whatever you want to say. He'd have a coin, like a quarter or a half a dollar, something like that, in his hand, and he'd be flipping that money, just rolling his thumb and the money in his hand as kind of, I guess, a little nervous thing. It beat smoking, I guess. So it was important for Vince. The Garden will always be Vince McMahon's utopia. Madison Square Garden, no matter if they run the Barclays Center or whatever, if all the wounds would heal and all the deals are right financially, the Garden would always be the mecca of a WWE event in Vince McMahon's eyes.
Let's keep it moving here. The company now has some momentum. They're starting to promote the main event for the greatest WrestleMania in history, the greatest athletic match of all time. Do you think promoting the greatest athletic match in history, et cetera, is that going to lead to disappointment anytime you say, this is one of the greatest matches ever? I mean, this is sort of timely because WWE just did this with Edge and Randy Orton, and it sets an expectation that is almost impossible to live up to. Is it not?
It is impossible to live up to because what criteria are you basing it on?
Right.
The greatest match of all time based on what criteria? Well, there's no criteria. It's just the fact that it's a great tagline. It's a great marketing phrase to gather and garner more interest. Hey, look, I watched Edge and Randy, their match. I signed both guys. I signed them when they didn't have jobs. Edge and Christian were working indies in Ontario, but they weren't making any money by any stretch. And of course, I don't know. It's just hard to live up to it. And again, it became really a marketing thing in this last greatest match in history, greatest match of all time, because I've always wondered, what do you base that on? That's like somebody asking you, Conrad, well, Conrad, who's the greatest babyface of all time? Okay. So if that's the question, that wouldn't pass a court. That wouldn't pass a judgment in a court case. You have to be more specific. Is it, what is the criteria that we're talking about? If it's just your personal favorite, that's one thing. But if you're going to say it's the greatest match of all time on a big scale, you got to give some background. I think there's got to be some criteria there. So you're right about the thing. You can never live up to the expectations on something that is that ballyhooed and marketed in that way. It's impossible. But I will take my hat off. I'm very proud of those two cats I signed and how they've matured over the years and made themselves a lot of money. And both, Edge's already in the Hall of Fame. Randy's a no-brainer. So, but it's tough. It's tough right there, quite frankly.
It is tough. And we should mention that, at the time of this, Bret is 38, Shawn is 30. And don't get me wrong, Bret had a lot of long matches with Flair and Owen, and Shawn had a lot of long tag matches, but this is going to be another level. And a week before the big match, Bret goes on the Chet Kopic Sports Talk show and said if he loses this match, he's going to consider retiring. Is this another wrinkle for Vince to add to the promotion? It feels like Vince really loves this idea, especially around WrestleMania. He did it with Hogan around WrestleMania 8. So 4 years later, he's going to tease, hey, if I don't win, I might retire.
Yeah. Good wrinkle. Another good log on the fire to keep building that blaze and that, the heat, no pun intended, from the fire. Nice. I thought it was good. To me, Bret, I don't think Bret had any thought seriously of retiring, but it sounded good and it was feasible. He'd had a long career. He had a great run as champion. What other mountains can I climb that I haven't already? So I thought it was a nice wrinkle, as you put it, to add to this storyline.
Let's also discuss the Bill Watts aspect of this. Meltzer has freestyled that perhaps one of the reasons Vince may have favored Shawn so much here is because of Bill Watts. And we've often heard that someone can pitch Vince a guy too much and it just turns Vince off to the person completely. And supposedly Bill Watts was pushing for Bret to be the long-term champion. Watts had just had a falling out with Vince. He's gone from the company. And the rumor and innuendo is that one of the big sticking points with Bill Watts was the Bret and Shawn disagreement. What really happened with regard to Bill Watts and Bret and Shawn here?
Well, I don't know that the Bret and Shawn thing was a major issue for Watts leaving. It contributed to the overall malaise that he had, that Vince was not listening to him and not doing what Vince brought Bill in to do. And that was to give him booking advice and help with direction and things like that. But Bill didn't like his role. Bill wanted to be the guy that he was in UWF, that he was in Mid-South, certainly, the final decision maker. And as long as Vince McMahon is alive, there will be no other final decision maker but Vince McMahon, period. You can look at Jerry Jones, the Dallas Cowboys. As long as he's alive, he's going to run the Cowboys the way he sees fit because it's his team. And Vince has a lot of the same characteristics in that regard of a strong-willed Jerry Jones. So, but I think I think Bill was just not a good cultural fit there, Conrad. I spent time with him, we didn't spend every night together or having dinner, this, that, and the other, but Bill was was uncomfortable living in Connecticut. It was not a good fit. I think Bill being a consultant, outside consultant, watching all the shows, having weekly conference calls with Vince, having little booking conference calls would have been a whole lot better than him living in Connecticut. And Cowboy didn't get along with Lisa Wolf, the HR lady. She didn't understand his abruptness. I remember her telling Bruce has probably told this story. She said one time after Bill left, "Nobody's ever talked to me like that since my father." So, but that's just Cowboy. You know what you're going to. Bill was not a surprise when he got there. He didn't act differently than you thought he was going to. He simply was just being Cowboy. And some folks could not understand that or go along with it. He was very abrasive at times, quite frankly, the big Cowboy. So, but Bill loved Bret Hart's work. I'll tell you that. But who didn't love Bret Hart's work?
Yeah.
It's not a matter of you love Bret more than you love Shawn. It's the fact you got a 30-year-old kid who's at the top of his game, who's in the Ric Flair category as far as working, and you know that at 30 he's just going to get better and better as a performer, maturing and things of that nature. So I don't know if that one match was the straw that broke the camel's back, but I know it was a contributing factor simply because Vince was not taking Bill's advice to leave the championship on Bret, which I found to be somewhat ironic because it was Bill Watts who hired Shawn, his first job, on the recommendation of Jose Lothario in Mid-South, and he made sure, Bill did, that Shawn was traveling with the Rock and Roll Express to learn the business, to feel what it's like to be a baby face and not a giant baby face, and understand the concepts and the philosophies thereof. So Bill was a big proponent of Shawn. So to him, it wasn't a popularity deal. He just felt like Bret was the guy that could have matches as a rugged baby face, a wrestling heel, whatever, and enhance anybody that he got in the ring with. So that's how I look at that. Now, I might be wrong on that deal. Bruce would know more about that than me as far as the that stuff is concerned. But I was very involved. But it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But I think Cowboy didn't get the role that he thought he was going to get, and it bothered him.
Let's talk about something Meltzer wrote here that I think makes a lot of sense. WWF business is the strongest it's been in years, and there's a theory that you don't change champions when business is making a turnaround. The argument continues when it comes to this business turnaround. Supporters of Bret will point out that virtually all these shows where business has picked up, it was Bret, not Shawn, that was in the headline or drawing position on the cards, and that a turnaround can be pointed to just a few weeks after Bret picked up the title from Diesel. Supporters of Shawn can point that you can trace a significant upswing in attendance and buy rates directly to the period starting with the Royal Rumble, when Michaels returned from his quote unquote career ending injury angle, and that his return was a prime factor, not the Hart Undertaker match and the shockingly good buy rate of that show. While Shawn was gone, the buy rate for the December pay-per-view with Bret versus Davey Boy was the lowest in the history of the promotion. In most arenas, Michaels has been some of the best reactions of anyone on the show. It seems like there's a bit of a split decision here in the theories. Where did you land on this? Was it time to put the belt on Shawn, or did you think, man, with that big sellout at MSG, maybe we should keep the belt on Bret a little more?
Oh man, that's a tough question. You know, history is going to speak for what it was. I'm in a position here to answer this question that there really wasn't a wrong answer.
Right.
Now, I'm sure some people could overthink it and oh no, here's the deal, and here's all the evidence, and here's what I think, and everybody's got that's their opinion. I respect people's opinion, unlike a lot of folks on Twitter and social media. If you disagree with them, you're a piece of shit, which is really sad. But I didn't know that there was a bad decision in this deal. You know, it's a matter of how is it going to affect overall business, and how's it going to affect the locker room. Things you have to think about. So, but Shawn coming back look, he's been there a long time. He's established. He was obviously, as I said earlier, one of the best ever. You know, I said, if I put anybody in Ric Flair's category, that's high praise.
Right.
I've never put anybody in Ric Flair's category for longevity and babyface heel, all those little things that you would consider. But Shawn and Rick are my top two, just personal. So I don't think there's a bad answer there. It's a matter, how do you do this and make sure both your talents are motivated and they're somewhat happy, because unhappy main eventers can be a cancer in the locker room because main event guys carry more clout. They have more clout, and they're on top for a reason, one would think. So if they're pissed off or they're unhappy, then they must be right. So that was kind of the issue there. How do you handle all the personalities? And let's don't forget either, Bret had his share of supporters, a lot of them in the locker room. Guys like Bret. He was unassuming. He was easy to talk to. And Shawn was younger, brash, cocky. And Vince saw a little bit of himself. I've heard him say this in Shawn Michaels. The attitude, the confidence, all those things, self-confidence was something that Vince kind of identified with Shawn. So, but again, the bottom line, there's no wrong answer on that, because both guys are going to be great champions, and you knew that the match was going to be extraordinary.
Let's mention too that we've still got to do all our WrestleMania promotion. And Bret does Regis and Kathy Lee on March 26th to promote WrestleMania. Regis and Kathy Lee were always a great ally to the World Wrestling Federation. How did Bret do in this role of WWF brand ambassador, if you will?
Well, Freddie Blassie was the link between WWE and Regis, because Freddie was a guest of Regis' local TV show back out in California for all those years, and on many occasions, one of Regis' favorite guests. Freddie was gosh almighty, what a talker and personality. But so that helped solidify that relationship. I thought Bret was a great brand ambassador because he was real, he was genuine. He wasn't playing the role of somebody that he wasn't. His name was Bret Hart. He was real. He believed in his realness, which is great. And so I thought he was he's always, the only thing about Bret, sometimes he had a little trouble telling time, being on time. I remember that we talked about that dungeon thing with him and Stu. He was like an hour or two late. So guess what? Stu gets restless at the breakfast table. And brother, when you talk about a breakfast table, it looked like the table in that, in the religious thing where all the disciples are sitting at the table, the huge long table. That's what we were sitting at by ourselves. And he got restless, did Stu, waiting on Bret. And let's go down in the dungeon. I'll show you a couple of things. I'm thinking to myself, you got to be shitting me. So I knew what he wanted to do. I think he was interested in me pissing my pants from some hole. So he gets me down there, and we thank God the cameras weren't rolling. So I knew. He said, if I hurt you, you just give me the office. Meaning I'll squeeze his wrist or whatever I can grab to squeeze. And so I to say I was quick on the squeezing would be an understatement. But it was just an interesting day for me, because of all the famous guys that were actually athletes, unlike me, that were in that dungeon that had been tortured, and that he had seen how bad you want to be a pro wrestler. We're going to find out today, type deal, because I'm going to hurt your ass. So the question is, will you be back tomorrow or next week or whatever the case may be? So, but Bret was real. That was just in his psyche. He learned this way. He grew up in this environment. He was a former amateur wrestler, but he was Stu Hart's son. And Stu Hart's son, Bret, was destined to be a modified, upgraded version of these fundamentally sound, I will beat your ass any way I can, including a submission, because he used a sharpshooter, submission hold. So I thought Bret did a great job there with those shows, the PR missions. He looked good, great smile, polite, happy to be there type thing. And any TV host that when you're a TV guy and you're interviewing somebody from the outside, and I've done hundreds of these, that when the guy is genuinely excited that you're talking to him about this subject, it makes everything so much easier, and it's such better television. And I always thought Bret did good TV. Was he flamboyant? Was he over the top? Did he, no. But he was real. And I think that came across on television very prominently.
We should mention that Meltzer takes note of something that I think is worth discussing. He writes, the Iron Man match in a sense shows a 180-degree change in the WWF's philosophy from the first WrestleMania back in 85 to in 1996. The company is putting arguably its two best in-ring performers and putting them in the situation to have a classic match. This is a shift. You go back and you look, and it's always Hulk Hogan and somebody. And then we tried to have a bit of a departure with 10. We made Bret, but we've still got Yokozuna and Lex Luger in the mix. And then we fast forward to 11, and we're going celebrity. We're going Bam Bam Bigelow and Lawrence Taylor. But now at 12, really, you've arguably got two of the very best wrestlers in the world, and we're giving them an hour to do their thing. This is a lot less, to use a JR saying or expression, a lot less sizzle, a lot more steak. Was Vince nervous about the shift? I mean, he's always been King Sizzle.
Yeah, he was a little uncertain how it was going to work out. But going back to that, you always know that they're going to have, Bret and Shawn are going to have a great match. And that's at the end of the day, that's the obligation of any promoter, of any company, is to create matches that the fans are going to enjoy because of their application from bell to bell. You obviously got to get a good build up. You got to tell a good story. You got to get us to the water, and then the horse is supposed to drink when it gets there. So I think Vince was probably a little bit uneasy, uncertain, because again, as I said earlier, how is our audience going to react to 60 minutes? Guaranteed 60 minutes. So, yeah, I think so. But again, the solace was the fact that you knew at the end of the day, those two sons of guns are going to have a hell of a wrestling match, and the fans are going to enjoy it.
We know that Bret and Shawn have been good friends for a few years prior to this. Shawn had even been to Bret's house going into WrestleMania 12. Bret says they're still friends, but not as much as before. Bret feels in this era, they started to become in direct competition for the top spot, or at least the top babyface role. Do you remember seeing their relationship change as we got closer to WrestleMania 12?
Yeah, it came a little more distant. Bret was more cautious. I think Bret probably at that time probably didn't fully trust Shawn's motivation. But I could tell that there was a little bit of they weren't hanging around at TV together. You didn't see them sitting at catering that many times and having lunch together. There wasn't hate, there wasn't animosity. It just was cautiousness on Bret's part, because Shawn knew his course. Shawn had been told where we're going. So he had a little bit of, I don't want to say bulletproof feel, but he had great confidence of where the destination that was ahead. So, but you could detect the fact that they were a little bit distant, but not so negatively that they weren't going to have a good match and not have cooperation. They're too good of pros. They're great professionals. They're not going to go out and embarrass themselves. That's what I always come back to Vince with. Vince, you got two guys here that are amazingly talented, as you know. They both have ample-sized egos. They're not going to have a bad presentation. Their egos, their skill sets, their mindsets will not allow it. And I hope that helped a little bit, because obviously we went ahead and did it, and I thought it worked out fine.
Let's get to the match. It's March 31st, Anaheim, California. Bret said earlier in the day of WrestleMania, he found Shawn at lunchtime and they sat down and planned out the match. Bret let Shawn piece out the first 25 minutes and then Bret did the rest. He said all told, they sat for 3 hours planning everything out. And Bret told him, I'll expect to be working a rematch when I come back in 6 months. And, Bret said that Shawn spent much of the morning planning a special entrance, being lowered to the ring by a steel cable. And Bret would write, I was impressed by how focused he was. He says, as WrestleMania goes on, many of the boys with tears in their eyes found him to thank him, as was custom in this era when the belt's about to change hands. If you carried the belt with dignity and work hard, was that always a tradition? And when do you remember this being the last time that it happened, that guys would come by and thank the former champion when he's dropping the title? It doesn't seem like something that happens these days, maybe from a more bygone era.
Yeah, it was from a bygone era when things were a little bit more traditional. And I often wonder today how much a championship actually means to current wrestling talent, because they don't get a chance to get comfortable in their role that often. The short tenure of some of the championships, I think, lessens the importance of the title when titles change indiscriminately and much too often. So, but back in the old days, that was not the case. Frequent title changes were what you wanted to always promote at live events. You know, people bought tickets to see Ric Flair on the road as the NWA champion because they hoped that their guy in their territory would have the upset of the decade, and their guy would become the NWA champion. So they were paying money to see Flair lose. And I say that respectfully to Rick. I mean, Rick knew his role. So Rick would always go in there and make these guys look better than they were, come within a hair, hog's breath, eyelash, whatever cliche you want to use, of losing the title. But somehow or another, through DQs, countouts, whatever, he always retained in that respect. So the local guy never beat Flair, but that was what they sold tickets on, the promise or the prospect of that happening. So I'm sure Pat Patterson had a big hand in that. Pat was a big fan of Shawn and Bret, quite frankly, both guys. Pat really loved those guys for different reasons. Pat was a sizzle guy himself, even though a great wrestler. But Pat, did a lot of things that were unique and new in his era, as far as his style and the bumps he took, things of that nature. Patterson was a great bump taker. Shawn Michaels was a great bump taker. But he also loved the stability of Bret. And when you got a talent like Patterson looking at Bret with such reverent terms, it's because Pat knew that in another era, that if he was going to wrestle Bret Hart, that he knew one thing: no matter what the finish is going to be, that the match is going to be tremendous. And again, I go back to this Iron Man match. I didn't call that match, but I watched every second of it, and I had a little dog in the hunt because I did the videos for Bret, his training videos, and I was a big fan of both guys' work. And I was curious to see how they're going to pull off a 60-minute match in Los Angeles early in the afternoon because of the time difference, how that was all going to work out. So, but Patterson, I'm sure, had a hand in keeping peace in the valley to some degree, and keep the guys focused on their task at hand. And if they sat together for 3 hours, you knew that both guys' head was in the game, and Patterson was only there to keep the rudder in the water and keep them sailing in the right direction.
Of course, the match is, some would say a masterpiece. Others have a different take. Shawn beats Bret in overtime, 1-0. They go 61 minutes and 52 seconds. So they go just over the limit here to win the world title in a historic Iron Man match. Meltzer would write, Michaels did a flying hurricane rana off the middle ropes, but it was messed up. He went for a drop kick off the top, but Hart caught his legs and got him in the sharpshooter with 34 seconds left. Michaels held out until the end without submitting. Hart left with the belt, but Gorilla Monsoon tells the ref to restart the match with a sudden death stipulation, which had never previously been advertised.
That was a mistake, by the way. We should have advertised that eventuality. In the case of this match going a time limit draw, the match will continue with an untimed overtime period, and the first man to score that pinfall is going to leave as the champ. We didn't, that was not explained well. And I think that was a mistake looking back at it in hindsight.
Meltzer would write, the pop for that announcement was shockingly tepid. In the overtime, Michaels immediately hit 2 super kicks and got the pin in 1 minute and 52 seconds and celebrated in the ring for several minutes afterwards, nearly choking up. In the celebration, Michaels did a Ken Shamrock by kissing Helen Hart and hugging Bret's son Blade. Bret walked out of the ring at the finish rather than doing a symbolic in-ring passing of the torch. He gave it 4.25 stars. What'd you think of the match? Did you agree with Meltzer's assessment? 4.25? Where would you rank it?
Oh, right there. It was a hell of a match. I enjoyed it, but I enjoy pro wrestling. Right. I enjoy watching guys wrestle and not try to cram, 3 pounds of shit in a 2-pound bag.
Right.
They had time. They took their time. They told a great story. That's probably all the matches that I did not call. The 2 things that come to my mind are Mick Foley's first title win. I was off with Bell's palsy when Foley won his first championship. I'd love to have called that, and I would love to call this match. But I think it fit my skill set better than it fit Vince's skill set, quite frankly.
Let's mention that Bret wrote about this. He says, with 5 minutes remaining, I hoisted him up like a sack of cement and snapped him across my knee. I smiled at the time clock. I told Shawn the last 5 minutes were all his and we were right on schedule. I leaped off the second rope only to be jolted by a vicious stiff boot to the jaw from Shawn, then one potato after another. He took every liberty he could, stiffing me on drop kicks and elbow smashes. Even so, we both knew the match was a masterpiece. This had been a beautiful movie to watch, especially since the crowd loved us both by the end of it. It was probably the greatest match I ever had, or close anyway. I squeezed Shawn's wrist to give him the cue that we were going home, and this ending, the better man would lose. After the match was over, Bret said, I couldn't believe my ears when I heard Shawn angrily tell Earl, tell him to get the fuck out of the ring. This is my moment. I had firmly placed the torch in that little monster's hands, but I also knew that no one was going to forget about me. With my head held high, I walked to my waiting Lincoln and burned rubber up the ramp as the credits rolled.
Wow,
man.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, you go back and there is footage, that you can actually see, Shawn says something to that effect, but the gist is the F-bomb and get out of my ring.
Yeah.
And something that I don't think a lot of people really paid attention to at the time is in that last 5 minutes, Bret's accusing Shawn of taking some liberties and throwing some potatoes. Overall, when it's said and done, what do you remember? Were Pat and Vince, everybody pleased with the match?
I think so. No one was happy that Bret was so distressed. Certainly Shawn saying what he said to Earl Hebner, the referee, was uncalled for. It was immature, and it didn't show the respect of the guy that just put the title on you. I didn't like that part of it. Now that I'm reading about it and hearing about it, unnecessary. It just showed, Shawn was again, we said earlier, 30 years old, man, top of the world, he's got that attitude, and you can either love and embrace that attitude that I'm the best ever. And I'm the right guy for this role. I'm going to bring sizzle that Bret Hart didn't in Shawn's view. So it didn't shock me to hear this. It doesn't shock me to hear this, but it's still disconcerting that it was very ill-timed. And the sensitivities of Bret took great pride in being the top guy. All those years he worked in tag teams with Jim the Anvil and all those things, his years toiling in the territory in Calgary, he finally became the top guy in the top territory, the top company in the entire world. And so he took pride in that. And so to be disrespected at his most sensitive moment was very, very ill-timed on Shawn's part. So, and that's not good to hear that. I'm glad. It's just Shawn's lucky that if he's throwing those potatoes, as Bret wrote in his book, which I have no reason to doubt, he's just very lucky that Bret didn't retaliate, and because Shawn could not handle Bret in that type of world. So it showed great character and integrity by Bret Hart to not lose his cool when he's getting stiffed.
We should mention that this is where the lines start to get blurred, because like we talked about after the match, Bret left the ring without shaking Shawn's hand. He basically walked right out of the arena
but
and left.
He told him he was going to, but Shawn, sorry, Conrad, but Bret told Shawn in that three-hour meeting what he was going to do.
That's exactly
I'm not
right.
going to shake your hand.
They planned it that way. They're basically wanting to work everyone, including the boys. And many of the boys felt like Bret leaving the way he did in his gear into a Lincoln right after was a shoot. And there had to be some sort of real life heat between them, some sort of hatred. And Bret said the next day at Raw, Owen would call him from the building and tell Bret, everyone thinks there's so much heat between you and Shawn because you wouldn't shake his hand. And Bret writes that he told Owen something like, that's the best thing in the world, and keep everyone thinking that. So we're trying to quote unquote work the boys. Are you in favor of that?
No problem, because the boys have big mouths.
Right.
And they like to add things. They like to embellish and add stuff that's not even factual. It keeps everybody guessing. It's what the business was built on over the course of time. The uncertainty. I remember when I got in the business and Bill Watts finally smartened me up after I'd already refereed several matches. I wasn't even smart to the business when I started refereeing, because they wanted to make sure I was going to stick around for a while. And here, 40-something years later, I didn't disappoint them. I did stick around a while. But yeah, it's what you wanted. You wanted the boys. I asked the point about Watts. I said, well, aren't the title matches real? And he laughed in my face. He said, no. That's the day he told me the most powerful weapon in wrestling was the eraser.
Well, I tell you, Bret feels like when he comes back and they eventually have the return match, it's going to be red hot. In other words, if the boys believe, then the fans would definitely believe it. And the first observer after WrestleMania 12, Meltzer would write, after the Germany tour, which ends on April 22nd, and the possible exception of a week of May bookings in Kuwait, Hart is expected to go on hiatus until at least the end of the summer. There's always been a lot of talk of Shawn versus Bret at SummerSlam, perhaps in a ladder match. There's also been talk that Bret may not return that quickly or even at all. But this tour of Europe is coming up here. They're going to have shots on the 7th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th, all over Germany. The first one, though, April 7th, is notable because this is the first time Bret Hart would wrestle Steve Austin, their very first match ever. Of course, Bret picks up the win, and then he spends the rest of the tour working with Owen, Triple H, Austin, and Bulldog. And he does an interview on the April 15th Raw from Germany.
I want to add something here. Look at who we booked him with. Everybody that we booked Bret with, Owen, Davey Boy, Stone Cold, Triple H, were guys that Bret wanted to work with. He especially, well, I remember very vividly, I hope that when we go to Europe, I get some matches with Austin. And we listened, and we thought that was also a good idea when you got two guys that are willing to work together and they want to work together, because we knew that Bret had a great respect for Austin and his fundamental soundness. Bret had high expectations for Steve, maybe before most guys in the company did. So just looking at that list of talents that Bret worked with in Germany was handpicked, and it helped Owen, it helped Steve, it helped Triple H, helped Davey. It was a win-win. So we took care of Bret's booking. Again, that was a show of respect from our side. That let's have him work with the guys that he wants to anoint as being better and help them get up the ladder just a little bit quicker.
As we said on the April 15th Raw, Bret's doing an interview from Germany, and he's basically saying other wrestling companies are throwing money around, a lot of money around. And he's basically portraying the guys who did leave, like Diesel and Razor, as being greedy. And the WWF is telling Meltzer it's not a question of whether or not Hart will return, only when. Let's continue though to mention that he's not done. He's still got dates on the 20th and the 22nd. Again, both of these in the UK, or in Germany rather. Bret over Helmsley, Bret over Austin. Fast forward to May, and this is where we see the Kuwaiti tournament, where Bret would beat Leif Cassidy, aka Al Snow, in the tournament. Owen would then later beat Bret clean in the tournament. Of course, we know Ahmed Johnson would go on to become the Kuwaiti tournament champion. But on the 11th and 12th, he's again working with his old pals, the Bulldog. And then the next day he's teaming with the Undertaker to take on Owen and the Bulldog. But come June, he's done. And in early June, he is, home when a documentary filmmaker named Paul J tells Bret that he wants to make a film about him and his life. And then he would drive to meet him at a film festival. Of course, we know this is going to become Wrestling with Shadows. When did you first hear about Wrestling with Shadows, Jim? Do you recall?
No, not really, Conrad, but it came to obviously the front of mind awareness, coming into Montreal in '97. So, you know, it was just a, you know, it's like it's like right now I have people with Viacom that are interested in taking Under the Black Hat and doing something with it, which is what Simon & Schuster does with all their books. Is they have an arm, because they're all owned by Viacom, CBS, you know, Paramount, all that stuff. So we have interest right now in Under the Black Hat as some sort of television or theatrical something. Now, am I excited about it? Of course I'm excited about it, but it's far, far, far from a done deal. So my point in saying this is that when you hear about these documentaries and these projected taping and the release and the content, you kind of take it with a grain of salt until it's more solidified. And quite frankly, until I saw cameras in Montreal and at Survivor Series, I never took it seriously, to be honest with you. It was another concept, another idea that a wrestler was being pitched that may or may not happen. And that's kind of like my situation. It may or may not happen. We'll see. But nonetheless, it was not a big deal, or we didn't talk about it every day. What about, Wrestling with Shadows and all that stuff? It just wasn't. It was a concept that was being pitched that we never were quite sure would it reach its fruition or not.
Bret also says that he goes to Vince's house in this era and tells him that he sees himself coming back eventually, but he'd like to come back with a chip on his shoulder after losing to Shawn. And Bret suggests the way they work a rematch would be where Bret would narrowly regain the title in another epic babyface contest, which would then set up a third match where Bret would put Shawn over clean, but this time he'd shake his hand and endorse him. And he writes that Vince and JR both liked the idea. Do you remember this meeting?
Yeah. Look, it's classic storytelling. It's classic storytelling. And the challenge is always going to be with Shawn in that era of his life. How is he going to respond? How is he going to react? Because Shawn could be very reactionary, and he influenced a lot of guys on the roster, sometimes not positively, and sometimes he's very polarizing with Shawn in that era. So, but yeah, I thought it was just good storytelling. It kept the story alive, involving two of the greatest workers in the world, and how people cannot understand that is beyond me. If you're a real wrestling fan, you want to see more of this good shit. That's good shit, pal. You want to see more of that. And so I thought it was very logical, very plausible, but I don't think it was universally received by everybody involved in the equation.
When Vince walks Bret to the limo after visiting him at his home, he says to Bret, "You're much smarter than people give you credit for." And Bret would write, after working for the man for 12 years, "I didn't know what to make of that." Jim, you know Vince better than anyone listening to this, I'm sure. Did Vince sometimes say stuff like this and it catch people off guard?
Sure. How many times do you think I've heard stuff like that?
Right.
Yeah, and Vince could be so motivational if he wanted to be. You know, he told me one time, said, "God damn it, I wish I could clone your ass." Okay. Then, you know, the next week I'm kissing his ass or something. I'm seriously, but something like that. He could manipulate you very well, but he was so respected, was Vince, by all of us that worked for him, by and large. Our guys will say, "Oh, I didn't ever like the son of a bitch," blah, blah, blah. They're lying. They loved his money. They loved the fame that he allowed them to earn and garner. But he would say things like that. But I'll tell you this. I think what Vince saw, that Bret had a great mind for booking and had logic that had heretofore had not been utilized by his company. And Vince would look at that as a missed opportunity. So whether you know, you're smarter than people give you credit for, I don't know what people he's talking about, but nonetheless, he's been known to say things like that. But I think, and I'm not just making excuses to the old man, I think he meant well by it. I think he meant that, hey, look, we should have been using this damn mind all along. Why weren't we? I don't understand. I let myself down by not going to Bret. And the old Bill Watts thing, I've told you this before. You know, when you have a situation where Watts was the owner and the top baby face, he wanted to make sure heels were contributing to the creative and buying into the concept so they have skin in the game and make their main event matches with Watts better, because they knew that at the end of the day, Watts is going to book himself a lot like we booked The Undertaker. You're going to lose by count out. You're going to lose by DQ. There's going to be blood. We're going to get to a blow off, and I'm going to go over with the Oklahoma Stampede. That's how it worked. Simple formula. And we're going to do that at the Superdome. We're going to do that 4th of July, whatever it's going to be. So I think Vince just saw the fact that Bret had, and it shouldn't be a surprise, he grew up in the damn business. Why wouldn't he understand things? And certainly he understood his program more than anybody else's because he felt it and he was living it. So I think there's mixed messages in that you're smarter than people give you credit for. I think there was more to it than just that simple statement.
Really great stuff. Bret said on his plane trip back home, he's seated right next to Shawn, and they talk, and Bret tells him it's to their advantage that everyone thinks they hate each other, including the boys. And Bret says, best of all, no one knew they were talking. Bret said, I told him I'd start building my heat by making some remarks about his in-ring character, but it would all be a work. And then when I come back, I'd beat him in a return match, probably around the time of WrestleMania 13. And Bret wrote, quote, I could see the color drained from his face. Clearly he didn't like the sound of any of this. And then Bret then explained that he would win the belt back in the third match, talking about Shawn, and that Bret would endorse him. And Bret said, quote, I wanted him to know that I understood better than anyone that Vince needed him to be the WWF's next big star and that he could trust me. In the end, I didn't feel anybody could make him like I could. Do you ever talk to Shawn about these proposed plans?
Shawn didn't trust anybody, Conrad. A little paranoid sometimes. Lifestyle issues, you know, all these things contributed to that. He was the smaller guy that overcame the larger guy stigma to become the top guy. Shawn and Bret both had this overwhelming thirst to be the number one guy in the territory, which you always want. I strive for that when we sign talent, and which helped make the Attitude Era the most productive and talked about era ever in wrestling. As far as live events and things of that nature, because we had a lot of competition in the locker room. And I always felt like that was to our advantage. Everybody stays on point. Everybody doesn't go out. Nobody calls anything in. Everybody wants to have the best match on the show, because eventually having best match on the show time and again is going to get you to the top of the card. So I always encouraged that competition. And we had a lot of that in the Attitude Era. Look at those guys that everybody was wanting a piece of the pie. What do you think motivated The Rock? He wanted to be the top guy. Well, there's this guy named Austin that was sitting ahead of him. It caused great competition. And when they were on the show, the other talents that were booked preceding them knew they had to do some damn good work, because you knew Austin and Rock's piece of business was going to be stellar. And it always was stellar. So that's kind of how I look at that. Shawn I'm not so sure that he thought that, that this was a long-term thing. I think he was insecure, as I said. But trust. It's all about trust. I think at the end of the day, Shawn and the people surrounding him sometimes fed him with a bunch of bullshit. You can't trust Bret. And why in the hell can you not trust? What evidence, what illustrations can you give me that would tell me you can't trust Bret? There were none, except somebody's ego and somebody feeding somebody that was very gullible, already insecure, more bullshit.
Let's talk about the July 1st Observer. Meltzer would report that WCW was out looking for their mystery man for the third man of the NWO, and everyone agreed that Bret would be the best guy for the spot. The WCW hotline even teased it, but supposedly Bret turned down every offer. Lots has been made about this on my podcast with Eric about who was or wasn't going to be the third man. When you guys see this NWO storyline developing over May and June and into early July, were you nervous given your contractual status with Bret that, hey, do we have him locked up? I only bring this up because of the Lex Luger situation where he debuted on the first Nitro. Do you remember you and Vince ever scratching your head and wondering, do we have something to worry about with Bret?
Well, sure. Anytime you get a star whose contract is the exit, the end date of the contract is within eyesight, so to speak, within arm's reach. Yeah, you want to make sure that you have some leverage and some control over the situation. You know, on Top Guys, when I signed Top Guys, if they signed a 3-year deal, generally speaking, not all the time, but generally speaking, we were talking renewal if we wanted to renew or extend or better deal, whatever. And a lot of guys that had low side guarantees that had out earned it and had proven themselves to be more valuable than we had perceived originally. Contracts were tore up and new contracts were issued before the existing contract expired. So that was a theory that I had because I didn't want to get caught with this Luger stuff. You know, even though Luger going to WCW didn't kill us, and he was their issue to deal with, but we wanted to make sure that we didn't get caught with our pants down, as so to speak, on that deal. So yeah, we talked about it, and I just never thought at the end of the day, if Bret was being paid fairly in his mind, and he was earning big money, which he was, that he would stay because it was WWE was his home base. That was always his goal, to get to WWF and become a star and become the main guy. So I thought that sentimentally, and shame on me because that's my naivete. It's when people say it's not about the money, bullshit, Conrad. It's all about the money.
The Ultimate Warrior is somebody who would probably agree with that. And you guys are having problems with him backstage. And on July 8th, the Observer would write, Bret Hart was called that morning and told that they were tired of Hellwig's constant demands and wanted him for emergency duty to work Detroit and Pittsburgh to make up for Warrior not being there. For whatever reason, Hart didn't come back. A call was then made to Sid Udy, who's been out of action for months, and he was brought back as a babyface replacement. What was Vince's reaction to Bret saying no here?
Well, obviously it wasn't good.
Right.
You know, he should be more loyal. You know, he owes me this and all those things. You know, he probably would have, that was a matter of communication. Look, in hindsight, what you do if you're Vince, you get on a plane and you fly to Calgary. That's
exactly what he did on July 23rd.
So there you go. He tried. And he just couldn't close the deal. And anytime Vince McMahon can't close the deal, there's consternation.
July 23rd, Vince charters a plane. This is before the company has a jet, and he goes to Calgary to visit Bret. 2 weeks prior, at WCW's Bash at the Beach, Hulk Hogan turned heel and joined the NWO. And Vince gave Bret a contract and told him to name his price. Vince said allegedly, whatever you want. And during this conversation, Vince would tell Bret that Shawn and Undertaker were making $700,000 a year, but Bret didn't sign, but he does give Vince his word that he'll return in the fall. When Vince doesn't come back with a closed, signed, sealed, delivered contract, are you nervous? Is the old man trying to sell it to you? What do you remember about this?
No, I had encouraged Vince that, you know, Bret's not a phone call guy, too proud, you know, all this character and integrity. You know, you should, if the guy's been with you for over a decade, doing great work night in and night out in any environment you put him in, he deserves a face-to-face. So if you can, I thought that it would impress Bret that Vince made the effort to fly from Connecticut to Calgary to address him personally. And I thought that would probably close the deal. It didn't close the deal because Bret had his mind made up what he wanted to do. And here's the thing you said earlier. Here's what gives me some solace, is that Bret gave Vince his word. And to me, Bret Hart's word was golden.
We would see Bret come back to finish these South African shots like he had promised before. September 8th, he's in South Africa getting a win over the Bulldog. Same thing on the 10th. That's Bret teaming up with Mark Marrow to beat Owen and the Bulldog. And then on the September 9th Observer, some details come out. Apparently when Hart and McMahon reached a verbal agreement for Hart to return after McMahon flew to Calgary to meet with Hart in the days following the Vancouver International Incident Show, the scenario the two agreed to was a match with Steve Austin at Survivor Series, followed by appearances at the December and January pay-per-views, and Hart would go back on the road full time somewhere in January to build up for WrestleMania. The apparent sketchy plan would be that they would shoot an angle at the Royal Rumble to lead to the Bret and Shawn return match at next year's WrestleMania. It would make sense that a title switch would take place at that show for several reasons. First off, Hart made it clear he wouldn't return unless the belt was in the cards, and he was happy enough at having to put Shawn over last year. It's doubtful he'd agree to come back if it meant putting him over a second time. Second, Michaels had apparently made it clear that he would put Hart over in a title match, provided he was promised to get the belt back at a specific time in the future. Hart had told business friends he was offered substantially more money by WCW, but felt that going to that company would be a step down. In your opinion, do you believe there was a discussion? Because Bruce has always said, no, Vince didn't work like that. Do you believe that Bret was promised a title win over Shawn for the belt at WrestleMania 13?
I'm skeptical about that, but I think that what Vince did have the ability to do is say that may be a great idea, and we'll consider that. But committing to that, I find a little un-Vince like. But in any event, I'm not buying that one.
On Raw Championship Friday, Brian Pillman says he's going to interview Bret at the Mind Games pay-per-view, but Bret's in South Africa at the time filming an episode of the Sinbad TV show. So they turn it into an angle in which Bret appears on Raw via satellite and says he's not going to be there and never made that commitment to Pillman. And around this time, they start to build on TV the eventual Bret Hart Steve Austin match. Austin's coming out making comments about Bret at the In Your House Mind Games pay-per-view. He does the in-ring with Brian Pillman and Owen Hart. And among the other things that Austin says is, if you put the letter S in front of Hitman, you have my exact opinions of Bret Hart. He's also on Livewire saying more things about it. He's going to kick the hell out of him, etc. Man, Bret handpicking Austin is a major moment for Austin's career, is it not?
Hell yes, it was. Absolutely. Showed great respect, vision, and Bret knew that, and quite frankly, to Bret's dissenters, that Bret would have a hell of a match with Austin. And if anybody remembers WrestleMania 13, they had in Chicago, they tore that son of a bitch up. What a great match. A double turn, hard to execute and make people believe it's real. But when you got two top stars coming in and positioned in one role, and they leave and they're in the other antithesis of that role, the 180, it's a great artistic achievement. And Bret and Steve certainly achieved that in that match. So Bret had a great feel for who he could have really good matches with. And quite frankly, I don't remember Bret ever having, picking somebody, anointing someone he wanted to work with, Conrad, that did not happen. He always had what he said he was going to have. It was really good matches. I want to say something about that South African thing. I think Bruce and I produced the TVs out of there for those that little tour, and it might have been the tour that I did commentary on the South African only television show with Owen, who was phenomenal as a color analyst, quite frankly. But that's what I remember about that South African tour, other than security issues and talents had to be sequestered in the hotel. We couldn't leave, and it was just a little dicey in that regard. So, but I think Austin would not be where Austin arrived. He would not be where he eventually would become without his exposure and his work with Bret Hart. And it shows how Bret was very unselfish, and he wanted to make Steve. And I believe that we didn't do anything more important for Steve and his run than his matches with Bret. They certainly made Steve a player.
Let's talk about something that is going to get us in a little bit of trouble here today. So we're going to stir it up here on Twitter. Bret said on September 25th, he goes to Los Angeles to do a guest appearance on The Simpsons. And Bret's lawyer, Barry Bloom, tells Bret that Eric Bischoff wants to meet with him. And Bret said they'd talk about it when he got to LA. When Bret lands and gets to his hotel, Eric is already on his way to his room. Eric asks him, allegedly, what's it going to take to bring you to WCW? And Bret supposedly said, I want the exact same contract as Hulk Hogan plus 1 penny. And Bischoff said, I can't do a deal, anything like that right now. And Bret said, that's fine. I'm not really looking to go anywhere. I'm happy where I'm at. And Eric said, come on, at least give me something I can go back to my people with. And Bret said, I'll think about coming to work for you guys for $3 million a year and a lighter schedule. And Eric said he'd take that back to the Turner people in Atlanta. And according to Bret, on September 27th, 1996, Bischoff offered him a contract for $2.8 million a year for 3 years to go to WCW. And Bret told him he'd think about it. Bret said Vince was hearing rumors that Bret had already signed, but on October 3rd, Bret called him and told him he wouldn't do anything until they talked first. Vince ended up calling him that weekend and asked Bret what the offer was. Bret told him it was $3 million for 3 years, working 180 dates. Vince told him he couldn't match that. And Bret said, I wasn't asking you to match it. Just give me the best offer you can. And Vince said Bret would never do, or WCW would never know what to do with a Bret Hart. And in hindsight, he was right. He said he needed a few days to think about it. And like Don Corleone, he would make him an offer he couldn't refuse. And then on October 9th, Vince flew back to Calgary to give Bret this offer in person. And during the meeting, Bret told Vince about the Wrestling with Shadows documentary, and Vince said he had no problem with getting Paul access to the matches in the backstage area. And in this meeting is where Vince offered Bret a 20-year contract for $10.5 million. It's $1.5 million a year for 3 years, and then $500,000 for the next 7 years as one of the senior advisors, and then $250,000 a year for 10 years to be on standby as the Babe Ruth of the company. And Vince allegedly tells him, quote, I'll never give you a reason to ever want to leave here. And Bret said WCW was offering almost the same amount of money, but for 3 years, but Bret just couldn't leave Vince. So he accepts the offer and they shake hands. And Meltzer would write a lot about this bidding war, but in recent years, Eric Bischoff has said, not true. I never made such an offer. And Meltzer got hot about it. And a lot of other people have argued that, no, it's true. I saw the contract. And Bischoff has said, produce the offer and I'll eat it. I will live stream me eating the paperwork because it never happened. What do you believe happened and now, and what did you believe happened back then with this WCW offer to Bret, and ultimately Vince having to make such a long offer to Bret?
Well, it was a very creative offer. Nothing like that offer had ever been made prior to, and I'm not so sure anything has been made since of that nature. You don't offer a pro wrestler a 20-year contract. It's not feasible in a lot of sense, physically, burnout, aging, all this other stuff. But as far as Bret getting a deal, getting that deal, first of all, not very many people knew what the deal was, only a few of us. But I had no issues with it, because if Vince believed that was financially going to be feasible to do, then he would know that better than anybody else, what he could or couldn't do financially. But we were all happy that bottom line is this, Conrad, those in the inner circle there at that time were happy that we were keeping Bret. You don't want to lose Bret. I don't think the Patriots wanted to lose Tom Brady, even though they make a big story of it now. Oh, it's better for the team. Bullshit. Come on. He's won 6 Super Bowls. He's a face of your franchise in New England, and now he's a Tampa Bay Buck. So we didn't want Bret to become a Tampa Bay Buck. A lot of us, because we knew what we had with him, and it was stuff that we could not replicate or replace.
Right. Well, I mean, you do land him, and supposedly when Meltzer gets word of the offer, it's nearly $4 million. Now, it's not all in cash. There are some other things that they're going to be offering and some other opportunities, perhaps like movies and television and things like that. But it's a pretty major offer.
Yeah.
And Meltzer would write, Hart, who apparently was WCW bound before meeting with McMahon, apparently changed his mind once, if not twice again, before supposedly making a final decision. And it was a secret from everyone in wrestling. Do you think this 20-year deal is something that Vince felt backed into a corner for and would have never offered, and just felt pressured to do so, and just way out of his comfort zone to offer such a lengthy contract?
Yeah, of course. He would not have broken the mold and created a new financial package and presentation if he thought that if WCW wasn't in the picture and offering massive money, it would not have motivated Vince to try to get in that game. So yeah, I'm sure he was uncomfortable with that situation. And, again, it was such a unique deal. There's no precedent for it, Conrad, to go back and say, well, we did that with so-and-so. No, we had never done it with anybody. I don't know if it had ever been done with anybody in the history of the wrestling business. Quite honestly, I don't think it probably had. So I think Vince felt a little bit pressured, and the WCW component was the catalyst for that.
Well, it's funny that we're talking about this now, because I think it came out, well, within the last year or so, that the Undertaker supposedly got a lifetime contract from Vince, and I believe it's a 15-year deal. Well, I mean, that's pretty incredible, don't you think? A 15-year deal for the Undertaker in 2019.
Yeah, it's incredible, but are you saying it's incredible in a bad way? No,
I'm just saying that Vince, knowing that he has this hesitancy to do these really long-term deals. I mean, he offers a 20-year deal here to Brent when he's 38, 39. And now the Undertaker at 54, a 15-year deal, obviously not all in-ring stuff. I mean, clearly we know the Undertaker, at least for now, is retired. But these sort of maybe what's incredible is Vince's attitude towards, long-term commitments with stars like this, who are so synonymous with the brand, the WWE. He's maybe changed his attitude about that. And maybe the financials, the economics have just become more feasible for him.
I think the rights fees that Vince and WWE have garnered from USA and Fox have changed that entire landscape and that pay model. Same reason that they had deep pockets and they were hiring every piece of talent they could hire, because, of course, the speculation was that they wanted to come to work for AEW.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, last I looked, Vince's net worth is a little over $2 billion, and Mr. Khan's net worth is $8.2 billion. So you don't want to see who's got the biggest bank account. That'd be silly. But think of this way, Conrad. Undertaker is not being signed a 15-year deal to wrestle.
Right.
That's not the deal. He signed because he's earned a retirement of some sort. He is a great asset in every phase of the company. WWE has never had anybody that's more respected universally within the company and their fan base than Mark Calloway. So you don't want to take a chance that you don't have him at your disposal for whatever you may need him to do. And most of that, whatever you want him to do, does not include him getting back in the ring and wrestling. He's, like you said, he's Mark's, what did you say, 54?
Yeah.
Is that how old he is?
I think so. Yeah.
Wow. Damn. Makes me feel old. You don't want to lose that guy. You don't want to lose. That's like, George Steinbrenner signing Mickey Mantle to a personal services contract so he could have access to him for other functions that the New York Yankees were doing. And so I think that's where that is. I have no idea about the 15 years if it's true or not. I also know Undertaker's talked about retiring on other occasions and didn't. So it's just a matter of what his body's going to allow him to do. But I think there's so many things that the Undertaker can do positively for WWE without ever putting his ring gear on again. That makes him a good investment. And the other thing is, Undertaker, to me, he would be a guy that I would use as a consultant on booking, on what do you see in this guy? Can you imagine the value that the Undertaker's going to have when he goes to the Performance Center to coach up these kids? You think they're not going to listen to the Undertaker? Are you kidding me?
Of course they are.
So I think it's a good investment for Vince. I think he made a good call there. And I don't think one really has the Undertaker's 15-year gig at his age and Bret's 15-year gig at his age or 20-year gig at his age are they're apples and oranges, because Bret still had plenty of years left, productive years left of in-ring activity. Undertaker does not. So one's one issue, one's another. But I know that the 20-year deal was, at that time, was totally unique, unheard of. But again, as I said, the guys like myself and Bruce and others that were in the inside, you don't want to forecast how it's going to be without Bret. He's that valuable. You don't want to lose him for any reason. And if Vince believed that the financial model of 20 years was going to work for the company, then we were there to support it.
Let's keep it moving here, and let's mention that Bret's old deal that he signed in September of 92 gave him the option to leave at any time with a 90-day notice. And he negotiated that when he learned the hard way in 92, when he tried to leave for WCW while he was still the Intercontinental Champion. Apparently those contracts were automatically renewable and only allowed the 90-day notice during certain windows each year. It's, I know you weren't there in 92, but do you remember on the other side thinking, hey man, we got Bret coming to WCW?
Anytime you have a possibility of getting a talent at Bret Hart's level, it excites you as a administrator, as a broadcaster, without question. So, but it wasn't widely discussed. Remember in 92, it was very tumultuous in WCW. It was very tumultuous for me personally. So my point of awareness was maintaining my own employment and continued growth within the company, and not who was or was not coming in. But obviously, not to downplay it, having the opportunity, because I never worked with Bret in 92. Before then. I'd never been around him that much, but I admired his work. And of course, I read The Observer, and Meltzer has always been very effusive with his praise of Bret, and justifiably. So it wasn't a big issue, but again, when you got a chance, it's a chance to get a guy like Bret Hart in your company, you're very, very fortunate.
Meltzer would write on the October 28th Observer, Bret Hart agreed to a 20-year contract with the World Wrestling Federation just prior to making the announcement of his returning on the live Monday Night Raw show from Fort Wayne, Indiana on October 21st. Hart, the subject of the biggest bidding war in the history of pro wrestling, turned down an offer from WCW in the live interview, acknowledged the offer and praised WCW, but he only referred to that company as a rival company to the WWF, saying they treated him with honesty and integrity in the negotiations. And Hart had been asked over the weekend by the WWF to, in dramatic fashion, rip up the WCW contract on live TV as a retaliation for things like having Medusa throw the women's belt in a garbage can on Nitro, but Bret refused to do so. Do you remember you guys asking him to do that, to tear up the WCW deal?
Well, I was not involved in that conversation if it did happen. Would not be surprised if it weren't asked of Bret to counter what Medusa did. The one-upsmanship, that was the competitive nature of the WWE, WCW rivalry was getting hotter and hotter. It was finally realized that unlike the old WCW, the WCW under Bischoff was becoming a viable contender because Turner had loosened the purse strings, and they had seemingly, I know they didn't, but they had seemingly had this amazingly large talent budget. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was asked, Conrad, but to answer honestly, as I try to do on the show, I don't recall it, but if it comes to the fruition that it did happen, that would not surprise me whatsoever.
There's another thing that Meltzer writes about that just fascinates me. He says there's yet another interesting key to this story. One of the things Hart had complained in the past that could stand in the way of his going to WCW was the presence of Hulk Hogan. Yet apparently in the final negotiations, McMahon talked about both Hogan and Savage's WCW contracts coming due between now and the end of the year. He suggested it was possible, and even suggested it was more than possible, that one or both, and Hogan being the most likely, would end up in the WWF in 1997. One would think if McMahon had brought that up, that a promise that Hart would get his elusive win over Hogan and the idea that Hogan might be there could have worked as a positive in clinching the deal. This seems silly to me, but Dave is basically suggesting maybe Bret is still sore about the way everything happened with Hogan and Yokozuna at WrestleMania 9. And it's important to him to get that win over Hogan. And Bret did write a lot about that in his book. Do you think perhaps Vince sowed the seeds of doubt that, hey, maybe Hulk's coming back and maybe we can finally do that Bret Hogan match we never got to in 93?
Very possible. You know, I was not privy to those conversations one-on-one with Vince and Bret on that topic. But I'm telling you that if all that were true and there was a remote interest in Hogan renewing his relationship with McMahon, which made Hogan famous and rich, that he might consider it. If it was a remote possibility, it's certainly a nice leveraging chip, negotiating chip, to throw into your formula. So I don't know that it happened, but if I had been in Vince's position and that situation was facing me, you're damn right I would have used it.
Bret, as we mentioned, he's in Fort Wayne on this October 21st Raw. That's when he makes the big announcement. Backstage, he runs into Shawn and asks, do you mind if I say something about your Playgirl magazine spread? And he wanted to start building the heat for WrestleMania right away. Shawn says, supposedly, say whatever you want. Fast forward a week and they do a split screen with Steve Austin and Bret as we build towards Survivor Series. Bret's at his house. It's a very intense segment between the two. It's very well done. And during it is when Austin said next week he's going to visit Brian Pillman's house, which we know became the gun incident. Bret said the week before Survivor Series, Steve flew to meet him in Calgary and work out the entire match. They're standing by the ring in Bret's pool room, and Steve told Bret he didn't feel Shawn was the right guy to lead the company. So Bret's feeling like, hey man, I'm justified in my feelings towards Shawn, I guess. And that gets us to Survivor Series, which recently re-aired on FS1 of all places. And this is one of my favorite pay-per-views ever. It goes down from Madison Square Garden, November 17th. Bret pins Austin in a truly classic match, 28.5 minutes. Meltzer gives it 4.5 stars. And Bret said that he felt like Vince and JR were taking subtle cheap shots at him during the commentary. What do you think of, what'd you think of the match? And what'd you think of Bret saying that you and Vince were taking subtle cheap shots at that Survivor Series match?
The match was great. The match was great. Quite frankly, again, another major significant building block in getting Austin to the next level through the compliments and the efforts of Bret Hart. The plan was, that Bret was going to become a heel. And so I don't, Conrad, I can't remember that commentary this many years later, the subtleties that he's talking about. But if that's if that's Bret's feeling, I can't deny it.
Right.
I can't say, well, no, you're just being paranoid. And maybe he was a little paranoid, but I don't remember ever taking massive cheap shots at Bret Hart. In a match like that, you have very little time to do background stuff. Now, a lot of companies are doing that now, where you have action in the ring and they're wrestling and they're working holes occasionally, or slapping their leg. What the fuck? God damn it! slap my leg. You're too busy. But knowing that sometimes it's not what you say, it's what you don't say in commentary. But we knew eventually that Bret was going to be a wrestling heel, which is my favorite characterization in all of wrestling, a wrestling heel. I love it. So I don't remember taking shots, and I was never told to take shots. Remember, McMahon was in the lead. I'm not passing the shit off to him and not taking any responsibility. I followed, like the guys that I work with now. I'm the point guy in AEW. And Shivani and Excalibur, I don't say they follow me, but somebody's got to start the conversation. Somebody's got to get us into the show from the break and take us to the break and navigate those waters. And that's what McMahon's role was at that time as the owner and the lead commentator. So my role was to fit into that scenario. But I'm not going to disagree with Bret that the cheap shots term might be something I wouldn't use, but I understand how he would use it. And I don't have any lack of respect or angst that he wrote that in his book.
I mean, Austin is a made man after this Survivor Series match. I mean, what a fall he's had. I mean, I guess you could go back to the summer though. I mean, he wins King of the Ring, cuts the Austin 316 promo, then has a rather interesting encounter with Yokozuna on the free-for-all where Yoko breaks the top rope on the free-for-all. But then as we get into September, he starts the trash talk with Bret. He has the whole gun thing with Pillman in November. He's at a sold out Madison Square Garden in a tremendous match with Bret Hart. Austin is a star on the rise in a big time match like this with a ton of time to tell a story. And he locks in the finish. It's the famous finish from WrestleMania 8 where he's got the $1 Million Dream on, which at the time was one of his finishing maneuvers. And Bret pushes off the top rope, uses his own weight and while he's in the submission move, catch the pin on Steve Austin. On the other side of this, Bret has made Steve a much bigger star, has he not?
Oh my God. Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, they're two peas in a pod, man. They're two peas in a pod, quite frankly, those cats. They had a lot of similarities, strong pride, strong feelings about their work, their love of the profession they chose, lifelong fans. There's so many similarities in Bret Hart and Stone Cold especially in that particular point in time. And I'm sure, and I know Steve, I still talk to Steve, often. He's never said a negative word about Bret.
Right.
Ever. So, it's really cool, man.
Well, we know that the stipulation of this match is the winner gets a title shot, at the pay-per-view in December, which is In Your House, It's Time. Of course, the original plan was probably for Vader to beat Shawn at Survivor Series. We'll talk about why that didn't happen. And instead Sid won the title another time. But now it's Sid and Bret for the main event in Florida of In Your House, It's Time. But the next night on Raw, the night after the Survivor Series, Bret would beat Owen. And then they're back across the water, as they say. On November 27th in London, Bret beats Vader. On the 28th at Birmingham, Bret beats Mankind by DQ. In Dubai on December 2nd, it's a one-night King of the Ring tournament. Bret would beat Bulldog, and then he beat Austin in the finals to win the tournament. And let's fast forward to December 15th at West Palm Beach, In Your House, It's Time pay-per-view. It's Sid and Bret. Sid gets the win with a clean powerbomb in about 17 minutes to retain the title. And after the match, Bret attacks Shawn at ringside, who was doing commentary at the time. So we're well on our way to our WrestleMania main event. Meltzer gives it 3 stars. You talked about, how Bret liked working with some of the other guys, whether it's Bret or Owen or Shawn or even Austin. What do you think about working with Sid?
Well, come on. Sid was an attraction.
Right.
He was a different breed of cat. He was a different flavor of ice cream here. So, different deal. It was a different deal, no doubt. But still, Bret looked at those situations as challenges because, it reminds me of the time that, that Stu told me about, stretching that Wayne Coleman, the big muscle guy, became superstar Billy Graham. I made him cry. It was kind of like the challenge of this big monster. What kind of match can I have with this big monster?
Right.
And, it was, but a different breed of cat, no doubt, a different ball game, different type talent, Austin was a bell-to-bell, everyday wrestler. Sid was best booked, best utilized as a special attraction. And so there's just different breeds of cat in that deal. But, you know, but Bret had the same thing, you know, back in that November 27th in London. We had him book with Vader. And big guys, a different body type. Bret liked those challenges. He liked taking guys that people perceived could not have a great match with him because they weren't quote unquote wrestlers, fundamentally catch as catch can wrestlers. But golly, he prided himself in being able to do that, and I don't remember him ever failing.
Well, they certainly stretched him to the limit when he comes back here. On December 17th, he's working in Daytona Beach with the Sultan, who we know is going to become Rikishi, but the Sultan here. On the December 23rd Raw, Bret would beat the fake Razor Ramon by submission. Oof, this is a weird time in the company, is it not? Bret and fake Razor?
Yeah, it was not good. And I was unfortunately implicated in that shit. Oh, really? I mean, come on. It's all ego, and, you know, we'll get back at them and we'll prove to them that we have this intellectual property. Vince could say all the right things and they all made some sense. Yes, you do own the intellectual property. Yes, you did get shafted in your view, blah, blah, blah. But the fake Razor, fake Diesel thing, to me, was one of the more embarrassing angles that I was involved in WWE. It was a lash out from a personal level. And of course, you know, I don't know that anybody, you know, I asked Vince, God almighty, why are we doing this?
Right.
So it's, you know, well, we have to protect our to him, it's protecting our intellectual property. To me, it was protecting his ego and showing them that he was going to fight back.
December 26th, Rosemont Horizon, Austin's going to team with Vader, and they pick up a win over Bret and Shawn. So this is kind of interesting on the heels of In Your House, It's Time, where Shawn and Bret get into it ringside. Now they're tag team partners here in Chicago. Let's fast forward a few days to Raw. On the 30th of December, Bret and Savio would team up to beat Austin and Farouk by DQ. But later in the show, they do an in-ring with Bret and Shawn going face to face for an interview. And Bret's mic keeps going out, and Shawn was great, as he sarcastically says, he wasn't worthy of going first ahead of the almighty Bret. And then Bret rips on Shawn, saying he promised to carry the title with prestige and class, but never came close, and said that if you're not 14 and female, you're not into Shawn. And he refers to the current gimmick of attempting to portray Shawn as a man's man by saying, whose man is he? And just as Shawn starts his comeback, Sid shows up, points out that he beat both, and asks for some competition. The lights go out, the Undertaker's music comes on, and he shows up. As all this is going on, Vader's trying to attack the Undertaker, but Undertaker beats him up. Taker and Sid now go face to face. Vader's back up again. Bret goes to leave the ring, but Shawn crotches him with the ropes and does a plancha on Sid, and everybody's brawling. And we're ready for the Royal Rumble. And it looks like Final Four even at this point. It's a pretty remarkable end to 1996 for Bret Hart. This is a very different year in Bret's career, but we know what's about to happen in 97 is going to yield his best work and maybe the most controversial ending ever. But that'll be a story for another time. We're going to put a bow on today's episode. Bret Hart in 1996. This is a fascinating story. And knowing what's coming in the following year, it's unlike any other. Isn't that right, Jim?
Oh man, are you kidding? One of the most significant years of all time for a lot of different reasons. Attitude Era kind of getting this rearing its head, developing what it was going to be. But yeah, following Bret's career in 97, and what it eventually led to, you know, I believe, Conrad, and we'll probably do this because we're are fan friendly to our folks that support us. I'm sure we're going to revisit. There's a lot more Bret Hart stories.
Oh my gosh.
And, you know, the finishing the 97, you know, the Montreal screw job, you know, Bret for years was pissed at me because he felt very confident that because I was so close to Vince, in my role there at that time, that I was quote unquote in on it. And I finally he and I met someplace or worked someplace, same place, same time, and had a chance to have a conversation about that. And I looked him right in the eye and said, I can't make you believe me. I can't make you understand that I had nothing to do with this scenario. All I knew is when I went out to do commentary with Lawler in Montreal, that the proposed finish, and my philosophy of not knowing all the details, I don't need to know all the information. I'm not an internet person to the standpoint, or social media person. Well, I need all the details. How did the movie end? I didn't want to know that stuff. All I knew is the working title, so to speak, was a disqualification. And I didn't even know who was going to get disqualified. It didn't matter because the title would not have changed. So, and he saw that I was being honest and forthright and talking to him with respect. And from that point forward, we never had another issue. And by the way, we didn't have issues during that incubation period, for lack of a better term, of him believing that I was in on it whatsoever. We never had a call, never had any, verbal issues. He handled it like a man, and as far as I was concerned. But I know that he had told people that he knew that I was in on it. But how did you know I was in on it? Guilt by association because of my role? And I've told this story before. I was pissed at that. I said, Vince, how the hell can you not tell me what you're fucking going to do? Because, JR, you're the head of talent relations. And if the talent knew that you were in on it because it was not going to be a popular decision, they would lose confidence in you. They would lose trust in you. And when they told me that, it made all the sense in the world. So I got off my high horse and said, I understand. I appreciate the you protecting me. But, this whole 97 was what a year, man. It was absolutely amazing. And it made every TV interesting because you just never knew, by God, what was going to happen at TV. The personal animosities kept growing and festering. And I think there's where Vince, myself, whomever else was there at the time, could have done a better job of getting these guys together and trying to clear the air to some degree. Let's come up to some level of compromise. But we didn't do that. We didn't do that, to my knowledge. I don't remember it. So, in hindsight, look, hindsight can be a lot of things, Conrad. I'm sure that you could look back on your life and say, man, if I had that to do over again, here's how I would do it. It wouldn't be that way. It'd be a different way. And my life is that way as well. So it was an interesting year. So there's a lot more Bret Hart content. And I know our audience likes to hear about Bret because of the respect they have for him, and they still have for him. He's universally respected. We brought him into AEW to present the first title, and that's how much he's respected. It wasn't the fact he's going to come to work for AEW, but Bret Hart anointing somebody, much like he did Stone Cold Steve Austin, means something. And it still means something. He's still that respected in the wrestling business. So anytime you and I can talk about Bret Hart under any context, I'm always in for that deal.
I can't wait to do it again. I had a blast talking 1996. Looking forward to covering Bret's 97 with you another time. But I'm looking forward to next week because next week we're going to do something you and I've never done before. We're going to watch the June 6, 1998 episode of Nitro. This is the Nitro from the Georgia Dome that broke all kinds of records, not just for WCW, but even cable television. It's the most watched wrestling match in history at that point on cable TV. It was Hulk Hogan dropping the world title to Goldberg. What a big night it was. I'm looking forward to watching that with you, Jim. I think it might be a goosebump moment for us.
I've never seen that show, ever 1 second of it. On those Monday nights, I was a little bit busy. And the last thing I wanted to do was to get home and watch more wrestling of somebody's product that I couldn't control. I was all about what we were doing and managing the talent roster and booking live events and things of that nature. But I've never seen that show, so it'll be a first for me. And also, Conrad, before we get off the air here today, I want to thank the fans for supporting us on AEW. Fyter Fest, significant event for all of us. It was a big accomplishment. We thought we had a hell of a show. I believe next week's show, the second part of Fyter Fest, is going to be equally as good. The talents are motivated. The little engine that could is still roaring along here and growing. So I want to thank everybody for joining us on TNT, like you can every Wednesday night at 8, 7 Central, and supporting what we're doing. I know that for Tony and I, we're having the time of our life. We really are. And it's not knocking, they're knocking everybody else they used to work for. Not whatsoever. It's just a good time in our professional lives right now. And so I hope that shows in our work. And again, I appreciate everybody tuning in for that. Did real well. And next week we have the challenge to do a better show. And that's what we plan on doing.
We are excited to see part 2 of Fyter Fest. It's next week on AEW on TNT. It's Dynamite. Don't miss it. And of course, if you'd like to go ahead and catch the July 6, 1998 Nitro, well, it's going to be early over at adfreeshows.com. You don't want to miss it, or the Bobby Lashley episode coming up later in the month. We'll have Fully Loaded 2000, and then we're going to do an all Raw watch along. So it's going to be a fun July. And then we've got great stuff planned for August, including one of our most requested shows I've heard about, SummerSlam 2000. Yes, it will be on the docket for August. Until next time, though, I highly recommend that you pick up Under the Black Hat. You can get it personalized from JR and get all your great grilling accessories you might need, your sauces, of course, the main event mustard, the Chipotle ketchup. You don't want to miss it. It's jrsbbq.com. Check it out right now. And if you want to sport some action out by the pool while you're grilling, go ahead and pick up a shirt at jimrossshirts.com. He is at JR's BBQ. I am at Hey, it's Conrad, and we are out of time. We'll see you next week right here on Grillin' JR with the voice of wrestling, Mr. Jim Ross.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.